This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I'll be speaking with John McAdams, an expert in the assassination, and Norman Ball about it, and the conversation will begin in a minute. In this segment, I'd like to open the show by having my two guests give a little bit of background about themselves and their ideas or their research into the subject at hand. John McAdams runs a popular website called the Kennedy Assassination, and he has links to many of the conspiracies, many of the major books, many of the major writers and people who have investigated the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. So welcome, John. If you could give a little bit of a background about yourself, what interested you in the assassination and your particular take on it.
Yeah, well, I got interested in the early 1990s in the wake of the movie JFK and got involved in an online discussion in a news group called Conspiracy.jfk, and that was interesting. And what I found was there was a huge amount of stuff out there that, if you researched it, turned out to be bogus. So I'm kind of a debunker by nature. So I've had a good time for, over 2 decades now, debunking a lot of conspiracy stuff, a lot of claims, a lot of theories that don't make much sense. So that's pretty much where I am. My website has grown over time. Sort of in a hodgepodge way. It's grown like Topsy, but there's a lot of material there that, I don't know, people who've just read 1 or 2 conspiracy books or seen 1 or 2 conspiracy documentaries don't know about.
Well, Norm, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself and your interest in the assassination.
Well, I'm a writer and a businessman. I came out of a corporate finance environment. My father was a little bit of an aficionado of the JFK assassination, the multitude of theories. When I was a young teenager, he gave me the Mark Lane book, Rush to Judgment. Very interesting book. I've since read, disparate bits. I'm by no means a serious student. I'm sure I'll learn quite a bit. But I'm fascinated by the very recent books by, Roger Stone and David Talbot, the A.F. Dulles book, Devil's Chessboard, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, I think 2013 by Roger Stone. There's some interesting, there seems to be an impetus, and I'm sure we'll hear this from your other guests, towards, the LBJ, Alan Foster Dulles, James Angleton, CIA, that nexus there seems to be picking up some credibility in the conspiracy circles. So it'll be very interesting to hear. I'm also interested to hear what your guest thinks about the Bugliosi book, which is the ultimate wet blanket on conspiracy theories, all 57 pounds of it. I read bits and pieces, but I confess I did not get through that entire book. But it's an exhaustive analysis and really debunks, and it sounds like Mr. McAdams is out of that school.
Before you answer, John, let me just ask, Norm, are you then saying that you take more of a sociological perspective, that you're more interested how the mythos itself has evolved rather than the criminal aspects?
As a writer, I'm fascinated by the metaphysics of it. It's almost like a Rorschach test. Everybody who was anybody has some implication. I think by last count, there were 82 gunmen that have been traced, to the grassy knoll in the Dallas Book Depository. It's a mammoth list, and there were 5 presidents that were integral to it. I think the recent. There's that fascinating picture, allegedly, of George Herbert Walker Bush, who didn't know for, I think, 25 years. He couldn't recount where he was on that day. That's a fascinating little piece of subtext. Of course, Johnson was there. Nixon was in town. Yitzhak Rabin was in town. And of course, Kennedy himself, obviously. So it was like a magnet. Who was not implicated ultimately in some conspiracy theory in the JFK assassination?
Yeah. John, before I ask my first question, let me just have you respond to Norm's question about the Bugliosi book.
It is huge. There's a huge amount of information there. There's also a lot of stuff that that's someone who knows a lot about the assassination, sort of a rehash of stuff we already knew. For example, the early part where it goes over almost minute by minute the events in Dallas. Certainly for anybody who believes in a conspiracy, but even for people like me, the tone is a bit harsh and off-putting. He seems to be mad at conspiracy theorists. He also sometimes chases down obscure conspiracy theories that nobody much believes. So in many ways, it's a bloated volume, but there's no doubt there's a lot of information there.
Yeah, it's sort of when I read the Bugliosi book, and this is, I don't know how many years ago, 15, 20 years ago, I had the same feeling that he was sort of debunking a lot of straw men that no one believes in. And not that I'm a believer in UFOs or a lot of stuff, but you see that when people talk about paranormal things too, is that they'll take the most extreme examples and use that to debunk things that are a bit maybe more believable, even if they may not be true. That's a classic argumentative tactic. Let me just state before we continue the reason I wanted to do this, because there are probably 100,000 hours worth of podcasting about the JFK assassination. And my reason for wanting to do it was about a year or so ago, maybe less. I saw on, of all places, cracked.com, which is a humor site, saw some article about interesting things that happen on the internet. And one was the population of what they called Syrian war headshot videos, which is sort of like, I mean, if you just Google Syrian war headshot, there are literally probably over 1,000 videos of young men getting shot in the head and dying. And it's pretty gruesome. And I'll have a link to just a Google thing below. So watch at your own emotional risk. But go ahead.
Dan, I think the Bugliosi book was I think it was 2007. It's only about 8 or 9 years old, I believe.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, and I think he's since passed away. If I'm not mistaken, but yeah, in a way, the internet is custom tailor made for all the labyrinthine subtext and conspiracies. JFK assassination industry, and I'm sure John will have a comment on this, really hit its stride with the internet and alternate news sources and the whole deep state Peter Dale Scott government behind the government. It's just it's red meat for those who are and I don't want to say paranoid, because that sounds clinical, but those who are deeply suspicious of the mainstream commanding narratives that through which we define our current era.
So what, John? I'll get back to my point in a minute. What do you think is the most likely? Are you someone that supports the Warren Commission findings, or do you find what theory do you think is the most likely?
Number one, the evidence that Oswald actually shot Kennedy is overwhelming. When conspiracists try to refute that, what they come up with is a huge, long list of evidence that they have to claim was faked, people that they have to claim were lying. It's almost impossible to convincingly refute the evidence against Oswald. So I think the only intellectually serious question is, was it Oswald alone, or did he have help, or perhaps someone put him up to it? I have not seen any evidence that Oswald had any help or that anyone put him up to it. So I think the most likely thing is Oswald, out of his own deranged mind, decided he was going to kill Kennedy and brought it off.
Yeah, but the thing that when the Zapruder film, to me, is the two things that are sort of the wild cards that have always stuck with me is the Zapruder film and then Ruby's killing of him afterward. And when I see the Zapruder film, since you mentioned getting into this after the JFK film, I think the famous phrase from that was "backward and to the left." This gets to why the Syrian videos of headshots to me are so interesting, because in every case, the heads move, and I slowed them down and watched dozens of them. The head moves in the direction of the bullet. So when you see JFK's head moving backwards and to the left, I mean, I don't doubt that Oswald was there and fully intended to kill him, and some of his bullets got there. But the Zapruder film and simple physics shows that there had to have been someone shooting from another direction. Do you dispute that? Because I know there was guys who had put watermelons on a stand and they shot from as far as Dealey Plaza, but the human skull is not a watermelon. You know that this was back in the 90s.
Yeah, I think it was a neuromuscular spasm. And depending on what videos you're looking at, most of the ISIS execution videos, which you can find on a site called zerocensorship.com, if you have a really strong stomach, you can see those, are shots in the head with handguns. Handguns have much lower muzzle velocity and much less damaging power than bullets from high-powered rifles. The House Select Committee looked at videos of a goat being shot in the head, and the goat's legs splayed outward, suggesting that when the brain is destroyed within a millisecond, the muscles tense and the stronger muscles in the back dominate. And that looks to be what happened to Kennedy. But there's something else you need to remember, too. Bullets can't throw people around. That's Hollywood ballistics. Your viewers might want to check a Mythbusters episode called Blown Away, where they did it once and then they redid it. And they found that bullets just don't blow people around. If somebody's hit by a bullet, the most likely thing that'll happen is if it's fatal, they'll just drop dead. Although sometimes people hit by bullets and run a block or two and drop dead. So all kinds of things can happen, but bullets just don't blow people around. That's Hollywood ballistics. Another thing you need to keep in mind is the medical evidence. The conspiracist favorite shooting positions on the know, there are two of them. One's the so-called badge man position, which actually is a very bad position, but some people don't notice that, and the House Select Committee acoustic position. Given that Kennedy's head was rotated slightly to the left at the time of the headshot, the bullet would have had to enter on the left side of his head. Well, if you look at the autopsy x-rays, which were published by the House Select Committee, there are no bullet fragments to the left of the center line. And it's almost impossible to imagine that he could have been hit by a bullet in the right side of his head without leaving any fragments on the left side or even an exit wound on the left side of his head.
Norm, do you have a comment?
Well, there's significant evidence, or I shouldn't say evidence. There are accounts of people clearly seeing puffs of smoke from the grassy knoll. There's been discussion of Corsican hitmen. What about Malcolm Wallace, the LBJ assassin, who according to Roger Stone, was responsible for 8 separate murders on behalf of LBJ in his path to power. Now, this may all be getting back to the Bugliosi prosecutorial type of, and he is rather condescending and withering. His I don't know, a lot of people object, as John does, to his tone in that book. All these titillating facts may not rise to a prosecutorial level, but there's so many compelling loose links that there's certainly grounds, and that explains this phenomenon, which fascinates me. Frankly, the phenomenon itself fascinates me more than the actual assassination itself. As you mentioned, Dan, the sociological implications, how this industry grows, how it will never be resolved. Now, quickly on the Magruder film, the Zapruder film, there's still missing frames. There's thousands of files that have not been released that will only be released, I think, in 2017. So even now we're making speculative judgments on incomplete information.
Let me get back to you had mentioned the badge man thing. I think the badge man thing is one of those things that's one of those internet memes that's kind of silly. The badge man to me is sort of like Slender Man for young kids, this horror thing. I mean, when you look at that, it actually reminds me of the blow up from the Michelangelo Antonioni film. You see a couple of little grains in the back, and it's absolutely nothing. Well, then you see Babushka Lady or something. But though, to me, those things are odd. The thing I find interesting about what you had said, John, is when you had talked about the Hollywood version of shooting. I I have been shot at, and I, twice I've had bullets come within probably less than a yard from me. And what I see in Hollywood too often is when someone gets shot, especially with some action babe in heels, they get shot and nothing happens to them. In reality, because I was when I was about 18, I was walking home from school, and these drug dealers, I assumed they're drug dealers, I passed right by them. They saw me see them, and they yelled at me, and I started taking off running, and I was maybe, I'd say, 50, 55 yards, 60 yards ahead of them. I escaped, but they shot at me a couple of times, and one of the bullets I remember, I could feel the sear of the bullet just going past me, and I was about, at the time, maybe 5'11", 160 pounds, and it knocked me off my feet in full stride running. So I later found out that's because a bullet always has the pressure wave coming before it, so I don't know about that. Ballistics experts that I've read have differed, but how do you explain, for example, the Jack Ruby thing, John? Because that to me is the other half. People who look at conspiracies would say, Jack Ruby supposedly wanted to avenge or spare Jackie Kennedy, grief. That seems to me utterly ridiculous. I mean, Ruby was mobbed up going back to Cleveland 35 years earlier. He owed, he was known to associate with mob figures. It just seems implausible that he would not have had some directive, someone saying, and I'm not saying that Oswald was in any way involved with the mafia, but it seems likely that this was a guy who maybe was shooting his mouth off. He was known to stand on street corners giving out his leaflets raging against Kennedy, as far as I've read. It would seem plausible that if some young yokel is talking about doing this, that maybe someone would say this is a good patsy. So you don't have to have a conspiracy where Oswald is, say, actually conspiring with someone, but people could say, boy, this guy is a good front man for us. How do you explain away Ruby then? If what is your take on Jack Ruby, John?
Okay, remember the conspiracy theory is that Oswald needed to be silenced. Why might Oswald needed to be silenced? Only if he knew something about some conspiracy, that is, if he was part of a conspiracy. Although admittedly he could have been a sort of dupe of a conspiracy, been manipulated by conspirators, with Oswald not knowing their ultimate purpose. But if there was any, if he was completely innocent, had no connection with any conspiracy, why silence him? He didn't know anything. If you look at Jack Ruby, sparing Jackie Kennedy was in fact one of the reasons he gave for silencing Oswald. He claimed to have read in the newspaper that Jackie would have to come back to Dallas to testify in a John Kennedy murder trial. In fact, laying on the floor of his bedroom was a copy of the Dallas Times-Herald that had an article that said exactly that. By the way, the article was wrong. Jackie wouldn't have had to come back, but Ruby probably believed it. But then you have to understand that Ruby was not the sharpest tool in the shed. He said other things, like he said to the cops, "Well, you guys couldn't do it; somebody needed to." He said, "I just want to be a hero." He said he did it to show that Jews have guts. And so he's the Army had made that point already. So in his adult brain, he gave a whole variety of explanations of why he did it. And probably it was a spur of the moment thing because he saw what he interpreted as a sneer or a smirk on Oswald's face, decided, he wanted to kill him. As for being mobbed up, he certainly had mob friends, but no mobsters would have taken Jack Ruby seriously. He was, the Yiddish term is schlemiel. He was a schlemiel. He was a screw-up. They wouldn't have tasked him with any serious task. But did he have mob friends? Yeah, remember he grew up in a rough Jewish neighborhood in Chicago. He was kind of a suck-up. He would suck up to mob types, to journalists, to public officials. So yeah, he knew some mob types. By the way, conspiracy people will point out that the asking for information. Ruby was a potential criminal informant for the FBI for a brief while in the late 1950s. The FBI dropped him as a potential criminal informant when they found out he did not actually have any useful information. There's no doubt that Ruby loved the idea of being a hotshot FBI informant, but he didn't actually know anything of value to the FBI.
In the next segment, I want to talk about sort of the evolution from the assassination over the decades, the waxing and wanings of some of the conspiracies. But I wanted to ask you, John, specifically about one aspect that I think has been overlooked. And I remember in 1988, on the 25th anniversary, on the television show 2020, I think it was Barbara Walters was hosting it at the time, and she interviewed the fellow who was the Dallas County coroner, I believe, at the time. And I think it was a whole hour devoted to this interview where he said, and famously, he was the guy that they took the body away from, even though legally he was in charge of, of the body and doing the autopsy, that when Kennedy came in, he had a huge gape, a flap that was hanging down out of the back of his head, and just a small bullet wound in front. Number one, did you ever see any videos of that? Because I can't find it online. Maybe I'm not looking correctly. I can't find any videos of that interview online. And if you saw it, what do you make of his claims and why the body was taken out of his jurisdiction?
Yeah, well, the medical examiner was kind of Earl Rose, who never actually examined the body. He didn't have a chance to. So anything he says about the wounds are not the result of his having looked at the body in Dallas. He was a member of the House Select Committee Forensic Pathology Panel, where he got to examine all the materials, including autopsy photos and x-rays. And he agreed with the rest of the panel that Kennedy was hit in the head from behind, and that there was a large blowout in the rear top of Kennedy's head and what's called a parietal bone. As for taking Kennedy's body away, several things are going on there. One, Jackie Kennedy was insisting she wasn't going to leave Dallas without her husband's body, and they didn't. Her entourage didn't want to leave Jackie in Dallas. I think there was a little bit of a regional prejudice there. They thought people in Dallas were, yokels or hicks or something, and wanted to get Kennedy back to Washington, D.C. As it happened, Rose was, in fact, a quite well-qualified forensic pathologist who, had he been allowed to do the autopsy, would have done quite a good job. And a lot of questions that were raised because unqualified pathologists, ordinary hospital pathologists who weren't forensic pathologists, actually did the autopsy at Bethesda. So it was a screw up. Now, sometimes conspiracists seem to take the view that it's normal for everything in government to work well, and if something screws up, it must be somebody's conspiracy. I've heard conservatives claim that if something screws up with Obamacare, it's really a conspiracy to bring full-scale socialized medicine to America. It can't be that governments and public officials sometimes just screw up and make mistakes. But clearly, taking the money out of Dallas was a screw up.
Yeah.
If I can speak quickly, I agree that the conspiracists tend to like to have it both ways. There is this tendency where if either the government is inept and can't do anything, or it turns on a dime and fashions these elaborate, multi-headed conspiracies. You can't have it both ways. A lot of people tend to try that. But back to the plausibility of Jack Ruby, here's a guy who was a low-level mobster who ran strip clubs. Suddenly, we're to believe, and it's possible, that he rose to the occasion to protect the honor of our First Lady at the time, and as to his haplessness as a low-level organized crime gentleman, at least he had access to the Dallas police force. He knew he was on first-name terms and had many friendships, and he could easily access the building. So, what he may have lacked as being the optimal hitman, he certainly had access.
Well, let's end it there, and in the next segment. Go ahead.
If I may just add, there is that fascinating right at the end of his life where he shouts out to a reporter, had Adlai Stevenson been the vice president, this never would have happened. He utters a lot of very cryptic comments at the end. Now, whether he's self-dramatizing himself or actually knows something, that's a very interesting.
Okay, Ruby read a book called, when he was in prison, in jail, read a book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon, which was an expose of Lyndon Johnson's somewhat sleazy, questionable activities in Texas, and decided that, it was Lyndon who was the conspirator. In other words, he came to the conclusion that LBJ had fought for the same reason lots of Americans did, by reading a book. It's not that he had any inside knowledge. When he testified before the Warren Commission, he begged to be taken to Washington, D.C. so he could convince Lyndon Johnson that he was innocent. Ruby became a buff. He read a book, became convinced that LBJ was behind the assassination, and sure enough, he believed that.
All right. So he may have had some grandiosity, a grandiosity complex, but he did leave some rather cryptic statements at the end of his life, which only adds to the mystique of this whole fascinating process.
Well, let's explore that mystique and sort of I'll have ask John if we can do a timeline in the next segment of the waxing and waning of the theories from the Cubans to the KKK to the Mafia, etc. And we'll do that in a moment. In this segment, I'd like to trace sort of the cultural, emergence of the JFK assassination. And I guess we can say that, we had Lincoln, we had Garfield, we had McKinley shot. After JFK, there were attempts on Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. And then, obviously there were Bobby Kennedy and King, and a lot of the civil rights leaders were slain. But the JFK one, I think, lives on in large part because he was president, and it was early in the rise of national media, and also we had the Zapruder film. But I think the idea of conspiracy came with the Warren Commission report. And I'm not sure, but I believe the Warren Commission report came out before Zapruder was made public. Was it not, John?
The first actual book to use Zapruder frames was Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas. Although for copyright reasons he was not allowed to use the real frames. Rather, he had an artist illustrate the frames, but he had analyzed the film in detail. He knew about Back into the Left. He knew that Kennedy's head actually bobbed forward a bit between Zapruder frame 312 and 313. So that was the analysis. Then the Zapruder film was shown at the Clay Shaw trial in 1969. And there were bootleg copies around after that point. And then finally, I think it was 74. I could be off by a year on that. Geraldo Rivera showed it. I think the network was NBC. It was actually shown on national television. From that point on, it was pretty much a public thing.
Well, when we talk about the conspiracies, I would think the assassination coming only a year or so after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Were the Russians the first ones? Were they the first suspects? The Soviets?
Not really. Very, very early on. We're talking about the day of the assassination. Lyndon Johnson and U.S. government officials were wondering if this was like the first strike of a Russian offensive. It would make sense it's what they would call the decapitation strategy. It might make sense if you're going to attack the U.S. to try to take out the leader. That quickly faded, and for the most part, the Russians were not blamed. There's been kind of an undercurrent of blaming the Russians by just a very few people. Not surprisingly, they tend to be anti-communist. The Birch Society put out materials saying communism killed Kennedy, but that's always been a very marginal form of a conspiracy theory.
Well, one of the Roger Stone and I think David Talbot's subtext is the reason that the finger was pointed at the Russians so quickly was that was an LBJ tactic to drive the Warren Commission to a rapid conclusion for national security purposes to unite the nation. That was a pretext to avoid and avert an exhaustive investigation. So that's a subtext.
Yeah, well, if you actually look at the sources, Washington officialdom was very wary about blaming communists, either the Russians or the Cubans or the Cuban government, because that had extremely dangerous possible consequences for foreign affairs. I mean, remember, the Russians had nuclear weapons. There had been the Cuban Missile Crisis. So officialdom really did not want to blame communists because they didn't want some public uproar about how the communists did it. We need to invade Cuba, or we need to nuke the Soviet Union or something. That's what all the documents show. That is what public officials were saying. And I think Talbot's simply wrong about that.
So was it more the media, the press of the day? Because it was common knowledge within probably, a week or less that Oswald's passed and his going to Russia, having a Russian wife. Was it more press-driven than DC-driven?
Yeah, but remember, it wasn't driven very hard by anybody because Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union and then his redefection to the U.S. really fit very well the narrative of a misfit and a malcontent. You could claim that it proved he was a communist and maybe a communist agent. A few people have claimed that. But really, the narrative the media adopted early on was this just shows Oswald was a misfit, was a malcontent, was the sort of person that might kill Kennedy entirely on his own.
Probably the most ludicrous in terms of major groups that were proposed was probably the KKK. Did anyone ever really seriously think that because of the Kennedys and the civil rights, was that ever taken seriously, that there could have been, elements in Dallas or in the South that were conspiring? Because that to me seems the least plausible of, if we talk the Russians, the Cubans, the Mafia, LBJ, the CIA. The KKK seems to be sort of the lowest man on the totem pole in terms of plausibility. Was that ever given any serious consideration?
Well, a lot of conspiracy theorists who ought to know better puff up the testimony of a guy named Joseph Miltier. Yeah. He was a sort of Klan type. He would drive around the South meeting with Klan types here and there. He actually had a Volkswagen minibus, interestingly, which we think of as a hippie vehicle. That's one of the ones he had. And he knew Klan types. And at one point in Miami, he described a scenario of Kennedy being shot from a tall building with a high-powered rifle. And this is touted by a lot of conspiracy authors as showing that he had foreknowledge of the assassination. There's a lot of bogus stuff surrounding Miltier, like he supposedly called an informant, Emily Somerset from Dallas, on the morning of the assassination. That's bogus. Miltier didn't say that until years later, and he contradicted his early accounts. But people should know better. That is to say, if there really was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, it had to be a fairly sophisticated operation. You have to fake evidence, you have to suborn, you have to corrupt lots of public officials, you have to get high-powered, important people in Washington, D.C., and prestigious people in the media to cover up for you. People sophisticated enough to do that who would not be members of the Dixie Klan. And in fact, while historically people in Washington didn't like the idea that communism killed Kennedy, and they might have been protective of, say, the CIA, there's no reason to believe they would have been protective of the Klan. They would have happily executed a few Klansmen if they could have pin the assassination on the Klan. So you're correct. That is one of the least plausible of theories.
Well, let me ask, start with Norm, since he's looking at the more cultural aspects. What personally for you was the book that got you interested in it? And was there a first conspiracy book or author that came along, and what was it and what influence did it have? Let me start with Norm and then go to John.
Well, that is my interest. I think the focus on the assassination itself is of secondary concern to a degree. What the JFK assassination managed to do, and this sprawling industry that really sprang up and perpetuates itself to this day, it pointed a lens out to American culture and society. Suddenly we found all these shady nexus of power and influence that we'd never really encountered or examined before. These dark, seedy pools of power that potentially had played a role in JFK assassination, but perhaps it doesn't really matter in a certain cultural sense because we learned that they were there. We learned there was a mafia with casino interests. We had being thrown out of Cuba. We learned that there was a deep state that was starting to form and coalesce. It was picking up steam. There are a lot of areas that the American people had been unaware of previously. So in a way, the focus on the assassination itself is maybe a misfocus. If you turn the lens outward, that's the fascinating sociological, cultural aspect of this.
John, what was the first book, sort of the counter? Because the Warren Commission report came out a few years after, I think 2 or 3 years later. What was the first sort of counter to that in the popular press?
Well, a couple of books that didn't get much traction was one by Buchanan. I forget the name of it. He was a European leftist. His book came out even before the Warren Commission report, and he got a Joachim Joosten, also a European leftist, put out a book called Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy. Those were pioneering books, but they didn't get a huge amount of traction. The first critical book that got a lot of traction was Edward J. Epstein's book, which examined the Warren Commission. And Epstein, although he wasn't really a conspiracy theorist, accused the Warren Commission of coming to a politically convenient conclusion. That is to say, he said they weren't motivated by a pristine concern for the truth, that politically they needed to come to a certain conclusion. That had a fair amount of traction because Epstein wrote in a fairly moderate, sensible way. That was followed by, I suppose, 2 big books were Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, which was serialized. It was parts of it were included in the Saturday Evening Post, which was an important magazine in the 1960s, and then, of course, Mark Twain's Rush to Judgment. Those were very important books. There were a lot of others, but those were, I think, probably the most important.
And what
Rush
was
to Judgment? I think was 66.
And what were their posits? Were they conspiracists, or were they just basically the government is a bunch of boobs? Did they posit a counter claim to the Warren Commission, and what was it?
Thompson stressed the evidence from Dealey Plaza and believed that there was a shooter in the depository, but there was also a shooter on the grassy knoll, and he thought a shooter on the roof of the county records building. So he wasn't long on theories about who did it. He just believed that there were, I think he believed in 4 shots from 3 different locations, which would clearly imply a conspiracy. Lane, I'm less clear on. He basically sort of got down in the weeds and stressed, for example, testimony that was at variance with the Warren Commission account. Lane did not have a lot of traction with, say, professional historians because he played fast and loose with the facts a lot. he was really unprincipled in his use of facts and his distortions, but it had a lot of popular effect.
Well, you mentioned Garrison and the film JFK, and that was based upon a real guy. Uh, I know that's the only time I think that there was ever any kind of judicial proceedings about the assassination. What do you think motivated Garrison? Was he just a publicity seeker, or what?
I think he was. There were some early theories that he was seeking publicity because he wanted to run for higher office. No,
Yeah.
I think he was a sincere conspiracy theorist. I think it was, in fact, rather a crackpot. Multiple sources say that his early theory was that the assassination was a homosexual thrill killing. That there was David Ferry, who was gay. He pointed out that there was Oswald, but Oswald, he said, could not satisfy his wife, so maybe he was gay, and blah, blah. That was his early theory. Then a lot of conspiracy theorists descended on New Orleans, and Garrison was easily influenced, and they brought him around to the idea that it was the military-industrial complex or the CIA or Lyndon Johnson. I actually have a page on my website of all the people that Jim Garrison blamed for the assassination, and it's a long list that includes about everybody you've heard of. So I think he was sincere, but I think he was, let me be blunt, kind of a crackpot. He would believe things on the basis of tenuous or essentially non-existent evidence.
Norm, you have a comment?
Yeah, I continue to be fascinated with what I might call the etymology of conspiracy, how it is this pejorative term, and I wonder, conspiracies are, it's a matter of degree. You have aligning interests, you have people perhaps with foreknowledge who don't actively try to avert something that's going to happen. When Mr. McAdams speaks in a very non-conspiratorial sense about Oswald, certainly Oswald didn't operate in a vacuum. What about someone who was highly impressionable? Are you suggesting, John, that Oswald was completely an autonomous actor in this whole affair?
Yeah, I'm saying that if you look for someone who might have influenced him, it's hard to figure out who that would be. Now, I think you're right that he was capable of being influenced. For example, he shot at General Edward Walker, a right general who was in Dallas. He may have been influenced to do that by some conversations he had, for example, with a guy named George de Mohrenschildt and with other members of the white Russian exile community, where they talked about how Walker was a threat, maybe a kind of incipient fascism was coming to America. So I wouldn't rule out that he was capable of being influenced. I'm simply saying if you look for some evidence of someone who might have influenced him to shoot at Kennedy, then you come up short. De Mohrenschildt, for example, was long gone from Dallas, was in Haiti. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's just hard to see evidence of that.
Is somebody who is highly impressionable and a patsy in some sense, have they not been conspired upon to behave in a certain manner that pleases other powerful interests? I mean, is that? I guess I'm making sort of I'm looking at the word conspiracy and the concept of it, and I'm questioning. None of us are hermetically sealed off from the context of who we are and how we operate, and I wonder. It's not a binary, is it? Conspiratorial, non-conspiratorial. There's not the lone gunman or the conspiracy. Is there perhaps a gray in the middle?
Well, I mean, there could have been a conspiracy that put Oswald up to it. That's possible.
So you would concede that?
It could have been. It's just that, for example, if you look at influences on his life in the last several weeks of his life, it's hard to see what that would have been. He was in a rooming house at 1026 North Beckley in Oak Cliff during the week, and he would go home and go to Irving and visit Marina, his wife, and his kids, and the Payne household on weekends. And it's hard to see what that influence would have been. It's almost impossible to prove a negative. So you can always posit that there was somebody meeting with Oswald in a way that we don't know and egging him on. It's just that it's hard to see who that would have been. There's no evidence.
I would say that's the Bugliosi strain of analysis, where something may not necessarily rise to the ballistics and the forensics to justify itself as a criminal conspiracy, but at the same time there can be things that perhaps are not the purview of a courthouse. There were aligning interests there, and JFK had infuriated so many power centers and was antagonistic to so many of them that certainly we could say at an extreme minimum that Oswald was fulfilling the dream of many of these interests, whether he was assisted or not.
Yeah, but these power centers, it's hard to see how they could have influenced Oswald. By the way, conspiracists tend to overstate the number of people that Kennedy was making mad. For example, the so-called military-industrial complex. Kennedy bragged repeatedly about how he was building up the military, building new weapons, and so there's the implication that the military-industrial complex wanted to go to war in Vietnam. Almost certainly the military-industrial complex cared more about buying new strategic bombers and new submarines and new Navy ships than they cared about just buying bullets and M16s for Vietnam. So I think conspiracists, with any president, can come up with a list of people the president has made unhappy. I think conspiracists overstate the number of people that Kennedy made terribly, terribly unhappy, and particularly, I don't see the nexus between any of those people. Remember the Joint Chiefs of Staff somehow approach Oswald. Even through an intermediary, and say, this Kennedy guy is bad news. You better shoot him. So I have trouble believing that without some evidence.
John, let me ask you, I grew up in the 1970s, and as a child, I remember some of the paperback true crime books were just coming into vogue then. And, certainly JFK was right at the top, along with Jack the Ripper and, the Manson family and whatnot. Do you think that it's fair to say that in the last 30 or so years that the Kennedy mythos, assassination mythos / conspiracy, if you want, has at least gotten a bit more focused in reality? Because there used to be, when I was a kid, it seemed any wild conspiracy, wild things were being flung out into the cosmos. But now pretty much most people will say that, okay, even if they don't believe that the kill bullet came from Oswald, that he was there, he was determined to kill, he had the gun, he had his fingerprints on it. It seems to me the earlier conspiracies would deny even that. But it seems to me it's pretty well conceded now, even by the most staunch conspiracists, that yes, Oswald was there. His intent was to kill the president. It's only a question of whether there were other people with him. Am I correct in that it has become more distilled, the mythos?
I think probably not.
No?
Recently, look, on online discussion boards, you can find people claiming that Oswald was standing on the front steps of the Texas School Book Depository when the shots rang out. There's a whole discussion about someone known as Prayer Man, some figure in photos at the front of the depository who has his hands together, which could be a sort of prayerful symbol, but probably wasn't. And they say it's Oswald. Well, the picture is extraordinarily blurry, and I guess you can think it was Oswald, except Oswald himself loudly insisted to the press. He said that he was asked, "Were you in that building?" And he said, "Well, yes, of course, since I work in that building. Yes, I was in that building." So he himself said he was in the building. And for example, in the 1990s, you got a big upsurge of Zapruder film fakery and forgery theorizing. Before that, everybody pointed to the Zapruder film and said, see, this is evidence of conspiracy. Then all of a sudden, in the 1990s, when people had analyzed the film more carefully, they started saying the film was faked and forged. Why? Well, for example, conspiracists have always insisted that the back of Kennedy's head, occipital bone, was blown out. The Zapruder film clearly shows the occipital area intact after the headshot explodes the right top of his head. So the response was, okay, the film is faked or forged. So I think what you've had, at least if you look at, say, online discussions, is a kind of proliferation of increasingly implausible theories.
Well, yeah, I'll grant you the online discussion boards, but I mean, as far as like people who've written books, some of the major works of the last 20 years in this vein, would you say that those people who have, written the major works of the last 20 years are a bit more in the ballpark? Because you're always going to find you can find any justification online for anything.
Well, it depends on what you mean of the people who have written books. There's a guy named Doug Horn, who's a Liftonite. He believes that Kennedy's body was waylaid on the way to the Bethesda autopsy and mutilated to change the nature of the wounds. There's a guy named James Fetzer who believes that essentially all the photographic evidence, including the Zapruder film, was faked or forged. Now, admittedly, people like Jefferson Morley, who doesn't actually explicitly propound any conspiracy theory, or Talbot, who I think is guilty of sloppy scholarship on a variety of fronts, don't seem quite so wild and weird. But it is true that people like Fetzer or Horn have had considerable influence.
Well, Fetcher he's a compulsive conspiracist, and he used to be quite prevalent up on Veterans Affairs. I think they parted company, but it is a very fascinating little tidbit. What was Officer Tippett's nickname around the police force? JFK. He's a remarkable, eerie resemblance. In fact, you'll see it on the internet. The two pictures side by side. Is that evidence? Would it stand up in a court of law? Of course not. But it's another odd. There is ample titillation surrounding this to certainly lend sympathy to these endless conspiracy theories.
It depends on what your standards are for titillation. I don't think Tippett actually looks like JFK. Well, the background, I should have taken my phone off the hook.
Yeah.
But,
Do you want me to pause here, and you want to get that, John?
no, I think that's
Okay.
I think it's going to stop. Yeah.
Well, let me just ask then, because what do you think the future of analysis? I believe it's in 2037, 75 years. No, 2038 maybe it is. I think it's supposedly after 75 years, information that was holed up somewhere in probably some Dakota salt mine or something is supposed to be released. Now, predictably, I think we can imagine what's going to happen. If there is some new evidence, people will say, aha, there must be more. And if it basically confirms, the Warren Commission version, people will say, aha, they're hiding things still. What is there information that was, or is this that is to be released after the 75th anniversary? Because this I've heard, in many books and many things. Or is that just another thing that's just total bullshit that's been tossed out there?
I haven't heard anything about anything in a salt mine. Jefferson Morley, who's been really big on this issue, points out that there are, I've heard different numbers. I've heard 11 or 1,200 documents. By the way, a document can be many, many pages.
Yeah.
To be released in 2017. And remember, there's something else to keep in mind is that if JFK assassination-related documents are to be released, sometimes there's a difference of opinion about what is a JFK-related document. If you have a new conspiracy theory that this or that person was involved, then all of their documents then become JFK assassination-related documents. So there's a bit of mushiness surrounding this, but pretty much the bulk of all the documents are supposed to be released in 2017.
Norm, what is your comment about what I just asked, and also where do you think the next 20 or so years of this is going to go? Do you think it'll eventually wane, or is the JFK assassination basically fated to become our version of Jack the Ripper, being endlessly debated hundreds of years from now?
I think it's got a ripperologist vibe about it. I think it's a bottomless pit. It'll never be resolved to the satisfaction of large numbers of people, despite no matter how exhaustively they release information. I think it has that dynamic of probably extending itself well into the future, unresolved, indeterminate.
Did you ever hear anything about a 75-year release or 75th anniversary release of documents? Because I could have sworn I've seen that online.
Yeah, 2017, I believe, is a critical release year.
Okay, maybe I got 37 or 17 release. Let's end this segment here, and in the final segment, I'll give both of you just a chance to sum up any thoughts you have about the Kennedy mythos, the assassination mythos, and where it's going to be going in the future as well. So we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking about the assassination of President Kennedy with John McAdams, who has written and maintains a website about the various conspiracies, the various information, and Norm Ball, who is a cultural observer and has an interest in it as well. Let me start with you, Norm, get your final thoughts on it. You said in the previous segment, you ended saying that it has that sort of ripperologist, Jack the Ripper kind of feel. Do you think that this also is sort of a uniquely American kind of thing? Because as far as I know, yes, there's the thing about the Romanov family in Russia, but America seems to breed conspiracies out of proportion to its sort of population. I mean, in UFOs, you have the Roswell incident, you have conspiracies going back to early Hollywood about Fatty Arbuckle and all this kind of things. Is America just, do you think, conspiracy minded more so than other nations? And is it basically something that due our granted constitutional liberties, that's just something that's part of a democracy?
I think there's a parallel narrative in American history, and it's reflected and increasingly being brought to the surface by the alt media. I think there is an official narrative and there is a subversive narrative. I believe there is a deep government with that extends beyond the red and blue charade, and I think that this JFK phenomenon feeds that sensibility, and has yielded fruit, if for no other reason. We may never know who killed JFK, but it has been a galvanizing event. It's energized this search for alternative information, and to that extent, it serves a purpose beyond the assassination itself.
John, let me turn to you, and let me go back to the beginning of the show where I had asked about, or had brought up my fact about the Syrian headshots, because as I said, I don't really have a dog in this water. You know, I didn't even bring up the mafia because that would take us probably another hour, Trafficante and Marcello and all that stuff. But it seems to me that the only way any kind of resolution would satisfy everyone is if there was some scientific evidence that could be brought to bear in the future. Like I said, when I see those Syrian headshots and I look at JFK, the Zapruder of it, something seems askew. And again, this is someone who's been shot at more than once. Do you think, like Norm, that we're just bound to argue about this incessantly as long as the United States exists, or what? Do you see any kind of resolution coming in the near future or far future?
Well, if resolution means that everybody agrees, no, I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that over time there's a drift toward the lone assassin theory. The latest Gallup polls and the late recent Rasmussen poll show the number of people believing in a conspiracy is down, although it's still a majority in the Gallup poll. The longer the whole thing goes without conspiracists producing any actual hard evidence of a conspiracy, the more people are going to decide, yeah, it's probably Oswald who did it. Now, that doesn't mean the conspiracy theories will disappear, because, yes, the alt media are very important, but probably JFK conspiracy theories will be like, I don't know, theories that aliens have visited the Earth, which a fair number of people believe. It's not even, I would say, utterly ridiculous, but it's going to be probably less popular. But it will still be out there. By the way, as for Americans versus Europeans, I think probably Europeans are more inclined to believe conspiracy theories
Really?
because they've been around longer than us Americans, and they've had a lot more conspiracies. I don't believe, for example, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff tried to kill Kennedy, but there were certainly a cabal of military officers that tried to kill Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah.
That's an historical fact. So I don't think Americans are particularly prone. It is true that in a pluralistic society with very pluralistic sources of information, conspiracy theories can have traction. And while I disbelieve most of what people think of as conspiracy theories, for example, the IRS basically conspiring against Tea Party groups, I don't think is a conspiracy theory. I think it was a real conspiracy kind of fact. But I don't believe in most things that are called conspiracy theories. On the whole, I think media pluralism, including some disreputable outlets, it is not a bad thing. Even occasionally, National Enquirer gets it right, although not any of the recent articles about Ted Cruz's dad.
Let me just ask a final question then, John. Do you think that the government bungled the case in any way, and that had they handled a thing a bit more above board, starting with, say, keeping Kennedy's body with the Dallas County coroner's office, that they could have avoided a lot of this? Or do you think that whenever there's something like this, inevitably, you're going to get conspiracies? In other words, do you think that the government, by bumbling perhaps, brought this upon themselves, at least the wackiest stuff?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's certainly true. If Earl Rhodes in Dallas had been able to do the autopsy, things would have been different. If Earl Warren, the Warren Commission, had insisted to Bobby Kennedy that the Warren Commission wanted the autopsy photos and x-rays to be examined by forensic pathologists, a lot of problems would have gone away. But look, you should never... Talking about a government that doesn't screw up is a kind of useless conversation.
Yeah.
That's not the government we have. We're a pluralistic democracy, so there's going to be levels of screwing up. Whether it's Obamacare or the Iraq War or you name it. So what I think we've had here is the probably about the normal amount of government screw-ups. And yes, you are right. If government had been more competent, there would be much less grist for the conspiracy mill.
Well, anyone who's enjoyed the conversation with John and Norm, below I'll have links to both of their websites. Norm's is Full Spectrum Domino, and John's is one of the most comprehensive websites that deals with the JFK assassination. I want to thank both of you for your time, and thanks a lot.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Dan.